Welcome, everybody. This is another episode of Studio 6 Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hill, and we have a special co-host tonight, Josh Hughes. Hello.
Yes. I was here as a guest a couple months ago, and you loved me so much you brought me on to be a co-host for today.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I'm so glad that I did too. We have a fantastic show today. Actually, we have Barry Fitzgerald on today. So. Let me tell you a little bit about Barry. Barry, Irish-born, 30 years experience in the paranormal field, has taken himself to new levels of intrigue and mystery. Barry also appeared on all 56 episodes of the Ghost Hunters International. He headed a team on the Sci-Fi Network. He's explored, the paranormal and supernatural phenomena all around the globe. His natural progression led him to writing, publishing books. Subjects within the field and research such as The Complete Approach, The Influence, My Home is Haunted Now What, In the Midst of Gods. Banshee is the one that I started to read, which is pretty good. And search for City, a series of investigative stories into Irish mythology and folklore called Legend Seekers. So without further ado, let's get Barry on and get going with this show. Hi, Barry.
Jay, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. Like I said, I'm a big fan. I love your work. I've started reading a little bit of the Banshee. Yeah. When they have it on Audible, where I can listen to you talk, read your book, that to me is. It just makes it easier. I love reading, but audiobooks are kind of where it's at for me.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. I'm with you on that. And I find whenever I'm out hiking or whatever I'm doing, that I can stick in the earbuds and listen and not concentrate on the grueling exercise I'm being forced to do. Instead, listen to the words and escape.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you've been in the field for such a long time. I wanted to kind of touch on a little bit of what was from the very beginning. What got you started in this, and were there pivotal moments in the beginning of when you were interested in the paranormal, and were there some things that happened that really kind of led you into this?
I tend to find that this is an answer which is very similar to the majority of people who get involved with the field, and the answer would be yes.
Okay.
Whenever I was young, around 4 years of age, I grew up in a house that was haunted. I didn't know that as a child.
Right.
My parents kept that hidden from us. But I had my experiences in the house, and then years later, I confided in my parents and I said that this is what happened. And they told me then that the house had a reputation for being haunted. And I have to say, moving on from that particular property, I have no recollection of having bad experiences. In fact, I have nothing but happy memories for that house. But for years following that, for at least 20 years, I've been plagued by terrifying dreams of that house, of knowing that there was something in the house that I had come across before, and I needed to warn these new people who were moving in. But this progressed on further and further and further until the house was actually knocked down and was destroyed, and everything stopped. The dreams stopped after that.
Wow.
It was odd. It was an odd one that I couldn't explain, as to what was happening there, what was the connection. And of course, growing up, I had that natural curiosity, and my father, of course, I have to blame him for some of this, because he sat me down in front of the TV to watch Doctor Who and Star Trek, and of course that just added to my enthusiasm.
Right.
I suppose in a way it was to get me to shut the hell up. Those were the things that they were the cornerstones really that got me onto the road. And from then I had my own experiences within many of the different fields. And that led me on to where I am today, of course.
So, did your family have any of those same experiences?
Yes, they growing up in that house initially. Yes, it was my mum who had the experiences, which again, I didn't know until years later. I was in my teens before my mum told us what was going on.
Wow. Yeah. I can't even imagine. My family did not experience it except for me, but so I can relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things are different. I'm sure growing up in Ireland and, some different things. And I just really, I've always been fascinated with, the Irish with the folklore and all that. And even like the castles and all
Mm-hmm.
that. It's just fascinating. So having you here telling me about all this is just awesome. So, I really wanted to kind of just touch base a little bit about, can you talk a little bit about how the group GHI came across your purview?
Well, of course, people know that they got to see me first off on GH when they came to Ireland.
Yeah.
And we investigated Lep Castle, of course. And I can remember poor Wheezy when he had set everything up and we were about to investigate. And before he hit the switch, I said, "Now you have got everything set for 240 volts, haven't you?" Yes. Yes. And I said, "You're sure?" Yes. Yeah. And he hit the socket and all of the fuses in the castle blew. And I looked at him with this wild gaze and said, "Now you're in its territory." The 110 is not very compatible with 240 volts.
Right.
But so everyone, of course, knows that it was a GH where they got to see me first off, and subsequently from then, I know that they were looking for people for the GHI, and they were asking for people to send in videos and things like that, but I didn't go through that particular vetting process or anything. They just phoned me up and said we're doing a show, an international show, and would I consider going looking for the paranormal around the planet? Well, I give it all of
yeah. You didn't want to give that up.
and that was that, and off we went.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, there's some things about I've watched. God, it's been a while now. But I mean, you can find all of GHI's videos on YouTube, and I kind of revisited some and watched a couple. And the one that there was one Amsterdam was good, but there was one where you guys were looking for Hitler.
Oh yes, was that in Argentina or was it?
Yeah, no, that was in Argentina.
Right.
Yeah, and that was just like, wow. I mean, it was just. Was there something about that one that kind of stood out?
Well, believe it or not, one of my personal favorites in regards the Führer was in Poland actually, because we got very, very little in Argentina. But when we went to Wolfschanze, the team had to stay in this bunker, which had been converted. It was a former SS bunker. So we had to stay in the bunker in these bunk rooms. And then we went from there into the investigative site. And it was a mass fortress of concrete fortresses across this huge amount of acreage. But I usually, and this is how I tend to grade a place, because I usually was at that time, I practiced a lot of night photography. And when we're not filming, I would tend to throw the camera over my shoulder along with a tripod and walk off into the darkness, and I would take my shots. I got through the gates of Wolfschanze, and about 10 steps in, I went, oh no. And I turned and went back again, and I never got night shots of Wolfschanze alone, let's say. That place was alive, and certainly had that ambiance of having activity. And that place was the first place in my experience that we had ever come close to Hitler.
Really?
But the reasons and the way that we went around to reach that, I had to keep with myself. I was aware that our thoughts can be picked up. Now, of course, a lot of my work now has continued on as to how that happens and things like that. But I had to keep what my plan locked in my head. I couldn't explain to the crew. I couldn't explain to the team members what I was doing. I just told them, bring this, bring that, and bring this. And the crew, I told the crew where to stand and be ready. That's all they knew going into this.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up in Hitler's bunker. Now Hitler was he was a very, very bad sleeper, and most times he was up all night. And he would listen to music, and he would speak to people. He would invite people in and do all this stuff. But it was here that at that particular time that we hit the music, and within seconds, this place changed. And I can remember Paul Bradford, who was standing to my right. He heard the footsteps behind suddenly walk behind. We knew we were being circled. And there was a heap of activity started coming forward through this, and when it came to an end, I can remember one of the crew coming to me, the camera crew, and they said, "We've been through many of these cases, but that was phenomenal."
Yeah,
it was the closest that I have ever come to Hitler. And
do you think like that was because this place was so important to him? I mean, this was pretty much his headquarters during the war, right? And
it was part of his Eastern Front. Yeah, and that the Valkyrie happened there. That's where they tried to blow him up. So he had been there many times. In fact, one of his train lines, which is still there, which his Iron Horse rode in on. He often used that line all the time to get back and forward back to Berlin.
Oh wow, I was kind of curious about that one with Hitler, just because there had to be the emotions and the energy and all that surrounding like those locations, that it's still there. It has to be,
right?
I mean, it's just, now kind of get a little bit off the train here. Have you ever researched any of his occult interests?
The Nazis, yes, yeah. I have been.
Let's talk about that for a little bit. I studied that pretty extensively in college. While we're on the topic of Hitler, like that was. I've taken many courses with my history degree, specifically about Hitler and the Third Reich and Germany during World War II. So I know that there's very different interests, specifically in what they were doing and some of the occult practices, where they were going to ends of the earth to find these, mythical occult objects. We've heard of, the what was the Indiana Jones movie? What were they looking for? The
Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail. So he put a lot of interest and thought into what they were looking for with that.
The Spear of Destiny was one of his.
It was one of his biggest ones,
of course. And the problem with the likes of that particular type of memorabilia is that if you try and keep it for yourself, it tends to end up in a bad way. And certainly it did, unfortunately for him. That's the way it worked out for him. But in regards to to what they were doing. Yes, there were a lot of suggestions that they were into the cult and everything else. Hitler himself, though, wasn't that interested in the occult per se. There were his minions below him. There were certain avenues of that were very, very well educated within those specific areas. But whenever you come to a point where you have to change history to suit what you're looking for, it becomes very murky. The paperwork, and this is what I tended to look for a lot, was the paperwork. Do we have any paperwork that can substantiate the claims that were made that came out of the back of the war, that they were doing this and all the rest? And the paperwork I always found was very sparse to support that. And Josh, I don't know, coming from your particular research project, did you find that the paperwork which set out what they were doing in the occult practices, what occult practices they were doing, and what they were hoping to attain, did you find any within your historical I suppose road of investigative that happened?
Right. It did seem like a lot of it was mentioned, but it wasn't really. They didn't dive deep into it because it really felt like they didn't want to be talking about it. I specifically asked my professor on numerous occasions about the Spear of Destiny, or some of the odd things like the bell that they were trying to create for time travel, or space flight. And she kind of just brushed it aside. It was really, it felt like something that people didn't specifically want to be talking about for whatever reason that may be. But
and that was the thing. That was something I was finding as well. The paperwork was very sparse on what they were doing. There was a lot of talk that they were doing it. And don't get me wrong, there are indicators there within history that they were doing it. But the paperwork isn't paperwork there to support it. And that was always a real problem for me. Now, that doesn't mean to say that since the war, and even before the war, there were certain levels of industry and everything else that were using aspects of the occult to try and advance their business and everything else that goes with it. Like in 1968, I have a report on file here of the Douglas Aeronautical Company that they were funded to make contact with aliens using a Ouija board.
Oh, okay.
To get advancements in engine design. This was in 1968. But the paperwork is there. We have the paperwork. I'm able to go down through the paperwork and see what results were they were getting. What red flags can we see from the information that they were getting? And what similarities do we see of the communication that they were using and the results to that? Do we see this mimicked throughout history? And yes, we did. So there are aspects of industry and everything else and that are involved in particular esoteric paths to try and gain the upper hand, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. I don't know if you've heard of this, Barry, but there's a story, and I don't remember where I heard it, but there was a story that there was a place where this building that supposedly housed something where Josh was talking about, where like a portal or like a time travel type thing, where this building, when the Allies had showed up and they were expecting to see all these Nazis there that were kind of into this occult, and there was nobody there. It was like they just all disappeared. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, I believe that's Poland. And I think, Josh, you had mentioned the bell before.
Yeah.
There was a lot of engineers there as well. Now, there is a structure there that, and it looks almost like a concrete Stonehenge, where the rumor was that this bell was attached by chains, and they were said to have accomplished time travel and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, though, further research has shown that was actually a water tower.
Okay.
And we have to take that idea of the bell and set it to one side,
Right.
because if we're getting the story, we have to look at the origins of the story, and also what's left, and what's left does not tie up with the story. The actual Stonehenge, concrete Stonehenge, was the base of a huge water tower that was to drive the factory that was next door.
Sure.
And that's that. It's amazing though how stories can develop and change.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of my interest in that, probably as a young teenager, was derived from the Castle Wolfenstein video games.
Oh yes.
So you play those, and they take all this occultism and they take it way out into left field.
Yeah.
But that started from that young age of like, what were they doing? And as you kind of start to do some of that research and you hear these stories, and it's just very fascinating. What they kind of put their mind and energy and time into.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever you consider that they really were starting to make huge advancements in technology when they moved the development and manufacturing underground,
right?
Because that's where you start to tie in with these things. We call them. You start to tie into them, and these beings are very keen on sharing information. But it was unfortunate that it came too late. For them, it was unfortunate that it came too late. That the advancements that they were making just weren't in vast enough numbers. Had the Luftwaffe had more of those new jets that they had developed, the RAF and the American Air Force wouldn't have stood a chance.
Right.
Jets would have absolutely annihilated them.
Yeah, I think there was one story I saw that they pretty much would have gotten as far as Chicago before the United States would have been able to do anything. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty scary if things hadn't gone the way they did, what Germany would have done to the rest of the world.
We would all be speaking German right now.
Pretty much, right?
Lederhosen.
Yeah. But no, I feel like we're starting to turn into a History Channel late night discussion here. When they have all the Nazi and the Hitler things, but no, stuff really is fascinating. Especially
it ties into with some of the paranormal stuff, because there was so much death and so much war. In Europe and all that. The leftover energy that is there. You could probably walk out into some of those war battles, just like Gettysburg here in the U.S.
Right.
And come across spirits or come across some energy or what was that, or so there's some probably even Omaha Beach. You could probably just set up a camera and catch something. You know what I mean? So
yep.
That's that whole energy of all that emotion is a big deal. And and shifting gears again, let's talk a little bit. I love castles. I love castles in Europe. You've investigated quite a few, have you not?
Oh, yeah. Well, I live in a country, if you throw a stone, you're likely to hit a castle.
Right. Right. So what would you say would be your scariest or your most interesting castle that you investigated that you really want to go back to as much as you could?
There actually is a castle in the south of Ireland. It's called I've forgotten the name of it now. It's just went out of my head. Macroom Castle. It's down in County Cork, and that particular castle was the setting for one of the Fitzgeralds to be butchered and eaten in front of the English who were sitting at the table.
Oh,
The story was, you see, that this particular Fitzgerald was a bit of a rebel, and I don't have an issue with that, but it seems that they couldn't catch him, so they organized with one of the local sheriffs. They organized a peace banquet. Now, I have to wonder to myself, if he couldn't get caught at what he was doing, he was obviously smart. But to fall for a peace banquet, that was just blatantly stupid. We've all seen Game of Thrones, and we know what way that ends up. But he ended up going there anyway, and the henchman that had been hired to find him was at the peace banquet, and he was butchered in front of the English, horribly, I might add, and eaten. And it seems that that particular castle, and this is a one-off for me, this particular castle is said to be haunted by a vampire.
oh,
And the blood runs down the walls and the screams come from the castle. I have been to the castle once, because of course I'm a Fitzgerald. I wanted to see the castle, and I got halfway up the stairs, and I said, "No, this ain't
no,
for me."
really?
And I actually left. And I would like to go back and do an investigation there, but I would be cautious. Let's say something didn't feel right there, and I would be cautious going there. Now, vampires, of course, we all have an idea of a vampire
Right.
from the movies and Bela Lugosi and stuff like that. But
Right.
there was the vampire craze that went through Europe in the 17th century. And that in itself was a problem. But in Ireland, we were having vampires here from the 12th century. So we have vampire graves dotted over the island. In fact,
Really?
I believe it was about 7 years ago, maybe 15 miles from where I live now, they uncovered a grave, and on top of this grave, this mass grave, were two vampires.
Oh, wow.
And the stones were jammed into their mouths, and they were
Hmm.
buried. One was an older gentleman, and one was a young man, maybe in his late to early teens. And so the old vampire goes back much further in European lore than what we initially thought.
And what
Wow.
is some of the thoughts behind that? Because I mean, these people weren't actually vampires, but were they being convicted of like witchcraft, or was it something else that was behind this?
Well, there's one story that I can give you from our mythology that comes from the north, up in Derry, and that particular story speaks of an exceptionally cruel chieftain, and who wouldn't give an inch to his people. Now, they asked for assistance in his removal, and they did. They got the assistance of some people that came in and helped deal with the situation, and he was dealt with and buried. Problem is that he came back the following day wanting his quart of blood, and they then buried him again. They of course spoke to the assailants. They came back and finished the job, buried him again, but he came back again. So this was a continual thing that they just couldn't kill this chieftain off, and he kept wanting the blood. And they ended up. There was a druid was involved, and they went through this particular magical process, and they killed him again. But this time they buried him face down, or head first, straight down, and pulled the ground around him, and then put huge rocks on top as well. And there was a few, of course, druidic spells and things put in place. Now, again, looking at the mythology of this particular place, we move into the modern age where they needed to clear some of the land, and the land that they wanted actually had these huge big boulder stones, because they knew that there was a chieftain that was buried underneath. And they went to move the boulders, and it was one of the chains had snapped, I'm led to believe, and took the arm off one of the farmhands.
No.
So, this idea of magic being used to keep the dead down, possibly still lasts to this very day.
Right.
That place was never cleared. The stones still remain there, and people who come across to Ireland can still go and visit the vampire's grave of Abertach, and visit it for themselves. But as I say, there are many vampire graves around Ireland, and in fact, the one 15 miles down from here, we didn't even know existed until they started pulling until they started uncovering the ground, and they found the mass grave.
Well, I never knew that. I learned something every day. Oh
Right.
My God.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible in itself.
But even if setting aside vampires at that particular moment, we have werewolves as well.
Really?
We have a Conry, the townland of a Conry, which means plain of the wolf, and that's where it's believed that some of the ancient, very ancient werewolf stories originated from. And further down the country, on the eastern side, there was a tribe down there that was known to change. Now, a lot of people would say, well, it's just in the people's head. They believe that they're taking on this persona of a wild animal. But this was not the case in this particular matter, because it was noted and recorded in history that they physically changed. Their appearance physically changed to wolves. So that was an unusual one for me to come across.
Right.
I believe the tribe were found in the townland of Ossory, down on the southeast coast, and I think that was around the 12th century as well.
So I think that kind of ties into a little bit of the mythology and folklore.
Right.
Okay, and you have a book on that.
Oh, many books, many.
So researching this information, did you like the werewolf? So I mean, did you come across something that you just really had a hard time getting your head around, or was it just?
Oh my goodness, yes. And I have to say that I've been researching the paranormal for over 30 years, but the experiences that I've had delving into the mythology and folklore outsurpasses anything that we did in the paranormal. In fact, some of them have been so extreme that I said, if I ever come across that again, we're done. One particular case I'll give you, for instance, we wrote a book called Legend Seekers, and within Legend Seekers, we went to the various different stories of what we went looking for to see if there was any truth behind it, and what experiences we would have when we went to the site. And what we tended to do within those stories is give people the GPS coordinates and the people who you need to contact to get permission to go to the site.
Right.
We wanted people to get back into the landscape and have their experiences with whatever was on the landscape. But this one case that we investigated, it began back when on top of this hill in the center of Ireland, where people were being ripped out of their beds at night. And there were old stone cottages, but they couldn't get any sleep. These things would rip the blankets off them and pull them out of the beds. And it got to a stage where the people just abandoned the cottages on top of this mountain. And when we were told the story initially, I tend to go and look at the old maps, especially looking for the Neolithic sites. Mm-hmm. Because if there's anything that lingers at a location, the Neolithic and our ancient Celtic brethren were exceptionally cued in to these spiritual invaders on the landscape. And sure enough, on this particular mountain, it was very, very clear, because around this location, we find settlements and standing stones and everything else, but nothing on the mountain. They stayed clear of the mountain. And that spoke volumes that this is much older than what we initially thought. Mm-hmm. But whenever we went to the site, the owner of the property now, he had bought it, and wanted to convert it into because there was a coal vein on it. So he wanted to draw the coal from the site and open a mine. And that's whenever the problems really started, for him anyhow. They built these sheds on site. They cleared some of the land and they built offices on the other side of the yard. The moment that was done, that's whenever all hell broke loose. And I'll give you an instance. One guy was in the workshop opposite the offices, and he was using a flat table saw to cut some timber. And as he was working away, suddenly he was clubbed in the back of the head. He fell forward and took his fingers off with the saw.
Oh, wow.
And this body, this person was seen walking from the tool shed across into the offices. Now, they never saw his face. They just saw the back of the person. They knew it was a person. And they would give chase into the offices, and this being was gone. Never any sign. But they ended up, because so many things was happening, new machinery was being brought to the site, and the machinery failed to start or operate whenever it was on site. They take it off site and it works again. So there was something on the site stopping them from digging further into the mountain. Right. And they ended up, one of the drivers for the mine stayed at the site, and above the offices he had his own space. And he was from Italy, and he brought in a large amounts of religious iconography because there was already a reputation, of course, with the hilltop at that stage. And he was happy enough. But when he left to go to town, by the time he got back, all of the religious icons were destroyed. The locks were never opened, and the doors were fine, but they were smashed to a point where they were actually pulverized into powder. And they brought the church in, and the church done several exorcisms of the site. And it got to I think it was the third or fourth stage, and they said, "Look, we have come across something like this in South Africa, and there's nothing we can do here. Just leave the place."
Right.
But every time that they brought in the church, the activity would ramp up, and it was building and building and building. And our friend, the Italian, said he was having none of it, and he started bringing in German shepherds, big burly German shepherds,
right,
to manage the site. This thing murdered 4 dogs.
Oh my gosh!
And absolutely destroyed the animals. And this is something we see across the board, in various other parts of the world as well. They attack the animals first because the animals have a superb sensory ability to detect them before we do.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up on site, and I brought my dog with me, and he was bigger than a German Shepherd.
Yeah.
And that night we had our encounter with something on that hilltop that did not want us there, and it made itself known, but it made itself known through the dog. The dog was the first one to pick him up because I didn't know that he was there, and it was quite unusual to see this constantly animal just sit and stare into darkness and just growl, constantly, and that was not his behavior. And also the vehicle that I had brought up, I parked it on the path that this particular person walked, and whenever we went back to the car, all the electric windows were down. Something I would never have done. So again, we were starting to see this electronic situation develop with the car as well, and there were a few other things that happened. But what we didn't do is we didn't report this particular story, and we didn't want to share the GPS coordinates, not because we wanted to keep it for ourselves. It was because we wanted to keep people safe. Mm-hmm. And we didn't want to recommend, look, of all the other places, go and see them, do not go here. And it was after several weeks after we had finished that particular story that I came across another mine, an open mine in Galway, where once they had opened it, people were being thrown to the ground
Oh,
by these beings, and machinery was being destroyed. But again, these are things that no one was talking about. And from a modern sense, I found it infuriating because our books, our bookstores are filled with stories of myth and legend from 500 years ago. It never stopped. It still continues. Today in our landscape, we have experiences, but we're not talking to each other anymore. And that I find is it really annoys me deeply. But on the bright side of that, I'm now starting a new book, which is now collecting those stories from the modern sense, from UFOs, from encounters with fairies and banshee and everything else, to see what's happening on the island today, and to hold those bank of stories for the next generation. And I think that's a very important thing to do.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow. That's wow. I mean, I didn't even realize. I mean, like I said, I'm learning something every day. So, yeah, it sounds like that. I'm just kind of envisioning that, like that mountaintop is just like I go back to the energy, and to actually have the dogs and everybody, I mean, just the stories alone. Now, you kind of said that there's other places you think that's at.
Oh yeah. Yes,
Okay.
we do. Even we see something very, very similar at Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. I was there in 2019, October 2019, and they were using dogs there a lot. They weren't pet dogs. They were trigger animals, and the dogs themselves were picking up on the activity before we were.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is because of what we're eating is having an effect on our sensory capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And that in itself really is a reflection on who we are as a species and how that can affect us when we enter a haunted property.
Mm-hmm.
If we, for instance, I'll give you a background to this. I was trying to understand this idea of when we walk into a property, and it's maybe just four white walls, we get this sense of yes, this is a positive, it feels really great. Or on the other hand, we could say, no, I don't like this. So what is that? What was that? Even though visually there's nothing stimulating about it, what is that we're picking up on that has us saying yes or no, possibly to buying a place or renting or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
And I was following some laboratory tests of biofeedback that was going on, and the computer itself was linked to multiple subjects, and the computer would select random photographs and display them on an image of, say, kitty cats or children laughing or little puppies, and everything that we liked reduced our skin resistance, the electrical sensitivity of the skin. We were confident in what we were seeing. We liked what we were seeing, so our resistance lowered. Now, over the period of time, the computer randomly selected a very negative image of a horrific car accident, and when we saw that, our skin resistance immediately shot up. So that's our fight or flight kicking in.
Right.
And the adrenaline goes up in the back of the neck and everything else, and the more that it goes on. But what was interesting in the experiments is that milliseconds before the negative photograph was shown, the body was starting to react. It was already writing the skin resistance before the photograph was actually shown by the computer, showing that we had something that was able to detect what was about to happen. What is that? And that in itself, I believe, was vocalizing itself through the immune system, through the fight or flight response.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that in itself helps us. The fight or flight is a very useful and necessary part of our gift of discernment. So for instance, if a spirit appears to you as a duck or a donkey or a little child, or Granny Greybird sitting on a rocking chair, whatever the case may be, if your skin resistance rises and you get the hair in the back of your neck going up, that's the negative tick. Irrelevant of whatever image it comes across as, if you react to that in a negative way, that is your body telling you, get the hell ready to move.
Right.
This is not what it says it is.
And, you know, Barry, on that quick, Jay and I had a situation where we were going to do an investigation at a house, a private residence that somebody contacted me about. And it was in the middle of December, this past December. And it was the night before. There was a huge snowstorm. I was having terrible nightmares about this place. And in the morning, Jay calls me and says, there's something wrong here. We need to have that fight or flight response if there's something that's going to happen. And I'm like, okay, let's just still go and let's figure that out. And as I'm getting in the car and he calls me again, he's like, we are not meant to go to this place. And then that entire morning I had the hair on the back of your neck and that skin, you know, you're just talking about it right now. I'm having that response because I truly felt that there was things that were telling us, you do not need to be here.
And this is the thing, you know, the new book that I released at the beginning of the month, The Deceptions of Gods and Men, taps into this particular aspect. And what I'm proposing is that in today's society, we use this aspect of a soul and a spirit. That terminology is very interchangeable within a modern sense, but that was never the case. The spirit at point of death was gone, but what we were left with was the soul, or if you like, the shadow, was left with the body for several days or several weeks before it finally broke free. But all psychic abilities, this is the hypothesis that I put through in the book, all psychic abilities is an aspect and a signature of the soul. Because the soul's responsibility is to keep this meat suit alive as long as possible so that the spirit can experience.
Right.
So, with this idea of the hair standing on the back of your neck and everything else before you go, this is your shadow telling you through the body. The body is I suppose is the blackboard of the soul. It's its ability to tell you, be aware, there are other shadows there. And so those are the dangers that it will present to you. And it's strange that you should say that, because usually we tend to find this type of response from people who have had extreme encounters before that possibly they may not remember within their childhood. They've had encounters of paranormal nature within their childhood, and what tends to happen is that the soul steps up to the board and increases its capabilities to make sure that you do not end up in the same situation again.
I've had that experience. I've been pulled out of a bed before.
Yeah.
Okay. And I was I had a growling, and it wasn't pleasant. Let's put it that way. Yeah. But that was the whole time. The only time in my life where I was like I wanted my mother.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I was in my 20s, but still. So that heightening that, that makes total sense,
No, but there is a way, of course, that can be switched off, and this is where it brings us back into the modern age, and we look at what we're eating and things like that. Refined sugar can shut off your fight or flight. In other words, if we meet in a fast food restaurant before we go to an investigation, and you drink some of the soda that's possibly got refined sugar in it, you're blinding your body's response. So you're going into this situation now blind. And that's an important factor to consider. And when we look at this aspect of how much refined sugar we're consuming now as a global planet, it's skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm.
And that in itself has served to detach us from those signals coming from our instinct, from our soul. And that is a problem. And when we consider, for instance, children that we're told are the most sensitive with spiritual aspects and everything else, there is actually two good reasons for this. Number one is that there is a filter that thickens over the eye between the ages of 7 and 13, which narrows the spectral response to the ultraviolet and infrared. So as an adult, we can, for the most part, we can no longer see what we saw as children.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, between the ages of 2 and 6, the predominant brain rhythm is theta. Theta is what we need to be in to have a psychic experience.
Wow.
So those are the two things that children certainly would possess. And isn't it interesting that when we look at these liminal areas within the calendars, that times whenever the doorways between our world and theirs is thin and they can come back and forward, what do we do with our children today? We feed them full of candy. We blind them.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Gosh. We had quite a few people viewing. Let me see. Somebody had a question. Now, have you ever been to Wisconsin, Barry?
I can't remember. I don't think I have. No.
Okay. Somebody had a question about something in Wisconsin. Since you haven't been there, we had
it's a creature very similar to a werewolf.
Right.
It's a local legend of something that, like a dog-like creature that would maybe call it something like a werewolf.
Right, and that's probably 10 minutes to 15 minutes from my house.
Yeah.
I mean, so, I grew when I was in high school. People talked about it, so it's been around for a while. But speaking about your last book, what else in there that you wanted to focus on, that you felt that would really be good for this book, the last book that you wrote? Is there something in there that I got to put that in there? It's got to be, just something that really kind of just spoke to you.
Yeah. In regards, a lot of the phenomena we tended to see, there were areas around the planet that tended to have more likelihood of having paranormal and high strangeness within those areas. Now, we use satellite data to target these areas, both north and south of the hemisphere. So we're able to see, going into a location or going into a country, we can say, okay, well, we want to select here, and this is why.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you tend to have positive magnetic anomalies, and we're not talking huge spikes in the field. We're not. There's subtle changes in geomagnetics. When we find those areas, that's where we tend to find the likes of UFO activity, abductions, mutilations, and poltergeist activity, and all of that stuff tends to incorporate itself in.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side of things, in fact, before I switch to the other side, Skinwalker Ranch, Brown Mountain Lights in Virginia, Hisdalen Valley in Norway, all these major areas that have high strange paranormal activity tend to be in positive magnetic anomalies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we tend to see. Now, there was the other side of the EM scale, which is the negative magnetic anomalies, and that was a strange one at the time, because that's where we started to see that there was an odd attraction to this particular phenomena that was happening there. Initially, whenever I stumbled on it, I set it to the side and said I'll come back to that later, because 75% of the world's top suicide locations appear in negative magnetic anomalies. Now that's not by chance. That's odd. Why would that happen?
Right.
What is in these places that is attracting people to end their lives there? What's drawing these people in? And I ended up going back to it and started analyzing it more and seeing that a lot of our ancestral places of sacrifice also appeared in negative magnetic anomalies. And I'm going back to 14,000 BC, for instance, in that particular aspect, and looking at Göbekli Tepe as one example in Turkey. And that place was known for headhunting and is also strongly in a negative magnetic anomaly. So, I started looking at that then, and then also seeing this thread of phenomena that weaves its way through a lot of the fringe research fields. And we started to see that these were key areas that historically our elite, our world, our leaders, our priestly class were going to commune with these things beyond the veil. In the Greek times, they were called the Word. So they were going to receive the Word from these things, them, if you like. And for that, they were giving us the rules and regulations of how we should be governed, which I highly took offense of. But whenever we look at the mask that this phenomena that was coming through the veil interacts with us, that was very, very interesting for me from my standpoint, because although you try and track the mask, you get nowhere. But if you track the phenomena, you get all the way back to Babylon. And that's what we did within the book. We pushed the boundary back. And when you consider UFOs, for instance, the real UFOs, not the ones that we make, the real UFOs, you will have phenomena such as missing time, mischievous natures, abduction, mutilation, and a conscious connection, of course, is also in there, and high levels of deception. We also find that is also the main factors when dealing with earth spirits, or what we would call over here the fairy. You also find in the Middle East where we look at the jinn. You'll also find out in the old gods. It's the same phenomena, different mask.
Right.
What we find pushing back through that. But I see that our time is running short. But what we write about and what we suspect the phenomena is certainly is not what we are led to believe it is. It is very, very different indeed, and has a darker nature that reflects us more so than anything else. But that's something we talk about in the book, The Deceptions of Gods and Men, which is available on Amazon.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'll be definitely picking that book up, because yeah, everything that you've said here today is, I've learned so much. And the one thing I wanted to, because we're getting close on time, but I really wanted to ask you, with your experience in the paranormal field and all the other things, that, like the books and being an author and all that, what advice could you give some of these younger kids that are coming into the paranormal field today that really don't have a clue?
Okay. There are two things that I will recommend. When you lift a voice recorder, simple thing as a voice recorder, and you say, is there anyone there? You have intent and you have opened the doorway. Remember, when you finish, close the door. That is an imperative thing, and it doesn't matter what you're using, whether it be a Ouija board, whether it be a device with bells and whistles on it, or whether it be a voice recorder. Your intent is being used to open the door. That is an esoteric path. It is an occult practice. We have to recognize it for what it is. You have opened the door. Make sure and close it with the same idea.
So, what would be a good example of closing the door? Is that just saying the session is done,
Yes.
I'm no longer welcome to talk to you. It's just something like that.
It's all about intent.
Right.
Right.
And
Oh yeah.
the intent to close the door, that we have to do that. We've arrived at a situation today which has pushed us beyond, and that in itself we have to be very, very careful of. And secondly, test what is coming through. Do not take it on face value. Work it, really scrutinize it, and because let's face it, if something is coming through with a positive intent, it will not mind questions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The ones that don't want questions and the ones that disappear the moment that you become suspicious, that will tell you loads. There's huge amounts of deception there. If they're there on a positive note, they will not mind the questions. Test the spirit. That is exceptionally important. We don't do that enough today.
Oh yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, some of the things that I've seen as of late, it's like in paranormal investigation, it's become a thrill, and
Yes.
that's not what it is. You know, if you're gathering information, then gather the information.
Yes.
But it's what you do with that information is important. You know,
Right.
I mean, either you're not just holding it on and saying, "Well, look what I got," and to show everybody. You know, there's a reason why you're doing it. What is that reason? And you talked about intent, and intent is everything. You know, when you go up to a house that is supposedly haunted, your intent better be as good as, you know, as it can be. You know, what you want to do. You know, you go in there thinking that you're going to irritate or, you know, piss off a spirit or do whatever, you know, you're going to get that back.
Right. Right.
You know, so yeah, so intent, everybody or anybody that's listening, intent is key. And
Yes.
Barry even said it. So yeah. Let's talk a little bit real quick about your books. Now, where can we find all your books?
If they pump over to charmstealer.com, my website, they'll find links to the books there. And the most recent one, of course, which is The Deceptions of Gods and Men, is available on Amazon. And Banshee, the third edition, will be available also on Amazon in hardback. And that will be available at the end of the month.
Okay.
Nice.
Okay, go ahead, Josh.
No, I was just saying, yeah, I'm looking up on Amazon right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I started listening Audible on Banshee, and, you know, I'm already taken in. So, yeah.
Well, I know that the Deception of Gods and Men is going to be available in audiobook as well.
Awesome.
I'm expecting that within the next week.
Oh, yeah. Definitely going to be getting that one. So everybody, I want to say thank you. And I want everybody who tuned in. We had a lot of viewers that tuned into this, and I want to thank my co-host. I want to thank my guest, Barry Fitzgerald. Thank you so much for spending time with us. It has been a very great pleasure finally getting to meet you, and, you know, hopefully we can do this again.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I
learned a lot today. I appreciate it, Barry.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Yeah. So having said that, I want to thank everybody again, and we will see you next time on this platform. Later.